Namaste. In the unnecessarily lengthy and perhaps laborious conversation last week, we started talking about the so-called secret history of Tablighi Jamaat. Let us continue from where we left. During the 2014 election rallies, Narendra Modi, not the Prime Minister back then, in one of the rallies recited an Urdu poem. The lines went like this. वो दीने हिजाजी का बेबाक बेड़ा निशां जिसका अक्साए आलम में पहुँचा मज़ाहिम हुआ कोई ख़तरा न जिसका न उम्मा में ठिठका न कुलजुम में झिझका किए पे सिपर जिसने सातों समंदर वो डूबा दहाने में गंगा के आकर. In brief, it means that audacious armada of Islam that sailed from Arabia knowing no hesitation from any fear, which was neither slowed down by the Persian Gulf nor stopped by the Red Sea, whose insignia reached every corner of the earth and which crossed all the 7 oceans, that same navy of Islam, when it reached the banks of Ganga, here it drowned. So Modi said in that rally that these lines are talking about the unsuccessful expedition of Alexander to India. But in reality, these lines are about the failure of Islam when it comes to India. Written in late 1870s, perhaps 1879, by Maulana Khwaja Altaf Hussain Hali, a friend of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan of Aligarh movement. It's part of a much larger work whose title is Maddo Jazre Islam, the flow and ebb of Islam, or rise and fall of Islam in India. This whole work poetically narrates how Islam once conquered this great country of India and yet could not sustain it, could not succeed in middle of the Hindus. Now this poem truly is a representative piece of literature from 1870s, and it stands for the great disappointment of the Islamist mind in India of that time. Disappointing naturally, because thinking from an Islamist mind again, that thought process, that ideology, which apparently conquered every land it went to, it marched victoriously in Central Asia, in Iran, in Africa, on the frontiers of Europe. Indeed, as the poem says, symbolically it crossed all the 7 seas. In fact, it ruled vast portions of India for multiple centuries, several centuries. And yet, it could not overrun India like it had the other countries. Also, just like it had even when lost politically or on the battlefield, such as against the Mongols, Islam had even then managed to convert the conqueror, and therefore in the end it was Islam that won. What did Islam achieve in India after ruling it for several centuries? The Islamist mind would ask. And that disappointment was perhaps further accentuated by more than a century of continuous failures in the jihad against the Kafirs. Starting from 1750s or so, they failed against the Marathas, they failed against the Jats, then they failed against the Sikhs, and in 1857 they failed against even the British. So as the dust settled on that failed jihad of 1857, The Islamist mind, indeed, just like this poem of Maulana Hali represents, would have been greatly disappointed. And that disappointment we can see channelizing into perhaps 3 or 4 distinct categories of reactions, interrelated, connected, and still somewhat different directions. So we can enumerate them in 3 or 4 categories, as I said, and first of those would be what I call small scaling of jihad. So after having failed on the battlefields several times, perhaps time was to change the tactic, and we see that starting with the 1870s and continuing throughout the 1800s, in fact well into the 1900s, there were a series of assassinations, lot of guerrilla kind of activities, and lot of street violence, riots, which if we study the reports of 1800s, we see that suddenly there was a spike in riots caused by the Muslims, and of course history of the riots is far older than that, and still we notice that with the 1850s, 60s, 70s, the intensity and the widespread nature of riots is particularly noteworthy. Assassinations, as I said, there were several high-profile assassinations done by fanatical Muslims, lone wolves. So in 1870s, the Chief Justice of India was murdered by a Wahhabi. Another high-profile murder was that of actually the Viceroy of India. The Lord Mayo, he got assassinated, stabbed to death in Andaman by another Wahhabi, Sher Ali Afridi, his name was. And then soon after that, we see series of assassinations of Hindu leaders, particularly the Arya Samaj leaders. So indeed, in few years, perhaps less than couple of decades later, the assassination of Pandit Lekram, who we can say was kind of the successor of Swami Dayanand Saraswati himself. So Pandit Lekram of Lahore, he was assassinated by a fanatical Muslim. And then his own successor, in a way, Swami Shraddhananda, was also assassinated by another fanatical Muslim few years later again. And this murderer of Swami Shraddhanand was in fact a Tablighi Jamaat associate, although he never acknowledged that, never admitted to that. Just like the earlier Wahhabi murderers also never admitted to being associated with those organizations either. So we see that was the first reaction. As I said, small scaling of jihad. If we cannot win on the battlefield, we can win in the streets, we can do the assassinations, and that is one thread of reaction. Another reaction was from the elites of the Indian Muslim society, the Ashraf, and especially the erstwhile aristocratic families who were employed and associated with the Mughals and the other Muslim ruling kingdoms. And this group, this reaction is best represented by the work of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan of Aligarh movement. Their reasoning, their introspection was that Muslims are losing because they haven't adopted to the modernity introduced by the Europeans, unlike the Hindus, who they argued have adopted the new education, new tools, etc. So they argued that for furthering the cause of Islam in India, Muslim society should adopt the new means and methods, new tools and technology. They should collaborate with the British. They should accept the English education as the new way. And this group, this reaction is often dressed up as the progressives within Indian Muslims. But just like Tipu Sultan is a freedom fighter, and Titu Mir of Bengal is a great revolutionary, so are these Sir Syed and his associates progressives. Limit and scope of their progress was simply, as I said, adopting the new means and methods. That never altered the mission of Islam in India, which always remained supremacy. That, however, was the second major reaction. Third was somewhat more religious and more inward looking. So there is this lore of Imam Mahdi in both Shia version of Islam and the Sunni version of Islam, where much after the death of Prophet Muhammad and just before the day of Qayamat, or the day of judgment, there would appear a great Muslim leader, redeemer of sort, called Imam Mahdi. So the Quran does not talk about Mahdi, but Hadith mention him. That he would march with a great huge army of Islam. He would be joined by Jesus the Christ, who would appear. They would do a jihad against both the infidels on one hand and corrupt Muslims on the other. And ultimately they would redeem the Islam on earth. So this disappointment of 1800s, we see pushed claimants of Imam Mahdi to appear. So of course, much earlier also, at the time of Akbar and soon before, there was other personality in India who claimed to be Imam Mahdi, and there was a sect of Mahdiism. Later in Iran, from Shia perspective, we see Baha'is who also claimed the same legacy lore of Mahdi. But right at this juncture, middle of 1800s and after, this Qadiani or the Ahmadiyya sect, founded by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, he and his followers claimed him to be the promised Imam Mahdi. This whole thing was another reaction. Now, in the passing, one quick comment. During the recent debates about this Citizenship Amendment Act, which the Indian Parliament brought to accelerate giving the Indian citizenship to the persecuted minorities of Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan, there was an argument made that if indeed persecution is the criteria, then Ahmadiyyas, who have been under much persecution by the Islamic State of Pakistan, should also be offered the same facility. Now, the folks who make that argument do not understand either the ideology of Ahmadiyyas or the history, more likely both. So Ahmadiyyas, if you study their own speeches and writings, have always been, since the origin, as fundamentalist, if not more, as rest of the Sunnis. Indeed, the murder of Pandit Lekh Ram of Arya Samaj was by an Ahmadiyya, a follower, direct follower of this Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. In fact, the reason was because Pandit Lekh Ram of Arya Samaj, he had entered an intellectual debate with Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. He had countered by writing a book in Urdu, refuting the arguments of Mirza Ahmad, and all these debates resulted in this violence and ended up in assassination of Pandit Lekh Ram. And later, if you study the literature, they are so much polemical against the Kafirs and so much fundamentalist that no sane person would claim them to be uh, anything much different from the rest of the Sunnis, except for their internal quibbles, which is not unique at all in their case. Of course, Shias call Sunnis kafirs. Within Sunnis, Deobandis call the Barelvis kafirs. Barelvis call Deobandis kafirs. Ahle Hadith calls all of them kafirs. But when it comes to the kafir proper, non-Muslims, all of them are competing with each other in more fundamentalism than the other. So that's one side comment. Perhaps one more side comment I am much tempted to make is that, like the official Sunni Muslims of Pakistan have declared Ahmadiyya as non-Muslims, and still Ahmadiyyas keep debating and ferociously fighting for the title to be a Muslim. Contrast that with how it happens within the Hindu society, where each sect, most of them at least, would claim to be as far away and removed and different from core of the Hindu society as they possibly can, be it Ramakrishna Mission, be it indeed Arya Samaj, be it so many other sects. They would, especially the followers of Swamis and Babas within the Hindu society, would claim to be different. If possible, they would claim to be non-Hindus even. So there are so many examples. So contrast that situation with the Muslims, where each sect would claim to be more Muslim than the other. So centrifugal force which works in Hindu society is exactly reverse in case of Islam. So that's a second quick side observation. But anyways, that was the third reaction. Fourth reaction, final reaction of that disappointment is far more profound and far-reaching and ideological. And that's why I kept it for the last. And it's also what is most related, most relevant to the topic at hand. So, some of the Maulanas who were direct participants of the 1857 Jihad and ideologically the torch bearers of Shah Waliullah, Abdul Aziz and Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, after the debacle of 1857, they introspected and deliberated over what's wrong. Why is Islam not being successful in India? And I'll come to what success really means. What is that criteria to define success in eyes of an Islamist? But they reasoned and they argued that Muslim society perhaps is not prepared to work for the Islamic State just right then. We have been spending so much energy fighting jihad on the battlefields, not being successful. So is it, first of all, worth spending so much energy on? Can we not achieve the same goals without having to directly focus on that jihad for establishing an Islamic state or a sultanate? Can we not achieve the same goals through other means, such as grassroots work? After all, establishing the Islamic State is only a means to an end, not an end in itself. Islamic State is meant to further Islam, to make this whole Indian society Islamic. Can we not make the Indian society Islamic without having to depend on the Islamic State? That was one argument, one reasoning. And second, why is Indian Muslim society not able to stand firm and really be successful? For that, their argument was that because Indian Muslim society is not Muslim enough, because Indian Muslim society is truly doesn't seem like a society which Allah would like to help. So these two, and I'm putting it very crudely, Um, it has a lot of nuances on both. But these two became the central points of thinking that number one, is it worth spending so much time and energy on jihad? Instead, same energy, why should we not channelize into a grassroots effort to Islamize the Indian society from within? And two, proper Muslim is different from what Indian Muslim in general looks like. And therefore, something has to be done to convert the Muslims to a proper Muslim. These two thoughts is what became the form of Deobandi Madrasa very soon. So as I said, these Maulanas were direct participants of 1857, and two of them, noteworthy among them, were young Maulanas named Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi and another Maulana, Abdul Rashid Gangohi. We had mentioned Gangohi in last week's conversation as the first teacher of the founder of Tablighi Jamaat, Maulana Ilyas Khandalwi. So these two Maulanas, they left Delhi, went northwards to a town of Devband on the banks of Ganga. It's an old pilgrim town of Hindus named Devvrand, which became Devband. So they founded a madrasa following the structure and shape and ideology of Shah Waliullah and Abdul Aziz, etc., as it had come down to them, but giving it a curriculum and giving it a shape which would train Muslim leaders for every city in India. And soon this madrasa became not just one madrasa, but within a decade or two, network of madrasas, and in entire North India within the next 15-20 years, and then in entire India over the next 30-40 years. So by the end of that century, they had a couple of dozen very large madrasas all over India. So that's the fourth and final reaction, which is what gave birth to Tabligh. So I mentioned 2 points of thinking. One was that instead of jihad, let's do the grassrooting or retailing of Islamization project. The same agenda and program which a state would implement, we can implement it from within the society itself. And the second agenda, which is make the Muslims proper Muslims, that is what became Tabligh by the efforts of the primary student of Gangohi and then next head of Deoband, Maulana Mahmudul Hasan, who also we mentioned last time. Their disciple, Maulana Ilyas, back then during the times when these madrasas were just progressing, he was a young teenager, and he became leader of taking that program and implementing it. At this point, let us take a quick detour to understand the process of conversion to Islam in India, so that we are able to understand and situate role of Tablighi Jamaat in that process. So the lamentation of Maulana Hali aside, that Islam had failed in India, look at the situation from the data and facts. In 1941, according to that census, the number of Muslims in the, of course, undivided India was about 100 million, which was roughly 1/4 of the entire population, which also was more Muslims than all the Arabs, Iranians and Turks added together. So more Muslims lived in India than in the so-called proper places of Islam, of its birth and initial success. So therefore, the disappointment of Maulana Hali can only be understood in sense that Islam failed to overrun India as it had done in Iran and elsewhere, and that the rate of conversion to Islam in India had been pretty slow. And still, this number, 100 million by 1941, which in our time is just perhaps more than 1/3 of entire subcontinent, at least officially, is not a small number by any measure. And therefore, it is incumbent upon us to properly analyze and study that process through which such a big mass of people came to become Muslims. So if we survey the historical literature on how did Muslims came to be in India, there are perhaps 4 answers that we get. First and most established one, naturally, is that Quran in one hand and sword in the other. So invaders, as they conquered the portions of India which they became successful in, they forced the population to convert, both as an immediate after effect of the war, which means that the people captured were given a choice to convert or be killed, as well as later in the time of peace, once the invader had become the king and established sultanate and a rule of law, then through a gradual process of both force and inducement, offering and applying pressures on the non-Muslim population to convert. Most of the times this process is very clearly visible throughout the history, right from the 13th century down to perhaps 19th century in India. All the Muslim chronicles and in fact Hindu accounts agree on that this was pretty evident process. This was a pretty common occurrence. And except for the deniers who refuse to believe both the Muslim writers and the Hindu writers of all the centuries, except for them, everybody else has a consensus that that was a process. So I would like to just quote one small portion from Professor Muhammad Habib. He translates a Persian work called Deen Panahi, which was written at the time of Sultan Shamsuddin Iltutmish, and it was supposed to be a state policy, Deen Panahi, state policy of how to promote and preserve Deen or Islam. So there are 4 points given as a policy, but the first point, that is the first and foremost way in which king should or state should promote Islam, is this, and I quote: "The kings should protect the religion of Islam with sincere faith, and kings will not be able to perform the duty of protecting the faith unless, for the sake of God and the Prophet's creed, they overthrow and uproot kufr and kafiri, shirk and the worship of idols. But if the total uprooting of idolatry is not possible, owing to the firm roots of kufr and the large number of kafirs and mushriks, the kings should at least strive to insult, disgrace, dishonor and defame the mushrik and idol-worshipping Hindus, who are the worst enemies of God and the Prophet." Listen to this further. "The symptom of the kings being the protectors of religion is this: when they see a Hindu, their eyes grow red, and they wish to bury him alive. They also desire to completely uproot the Brahmins, who are the leaders of kufr and shirk, and owing to whom kufr and shirk are spread, and the commandments of kufr are enforced. Owing to the fear and terror of the kings of Islam, not a single enemy of Allah and the Prophet can drink water that is sweet, or stretch his legs on his bed and go to sleep in peace. And then this Deen Panahi document at the court of Iltutmish proposing or promoting the state policy of how to deal with the protection of Islam, promotion of Islam. In fact, Professor Muhammad Habib goes on to say that his Iltutmish's direct descendant soon after, Balban, he would call his relatives, his sons and nephews, and he would tell them about Deen Panahi, and he would cry and weep and wail and say, I am not able to practice on this state policy because I am not strong enough. And then he would say that therefore other ways of serving the Islam. But ultimately, practicable or not, this is simply one sample, very small sample from a huge set of literature available, where Muslim chronicles never hesitate to say that this was the policy and this should be the policy according to an Islamist. So, in times of peace, this policy was still implemented in various means, such as non-Muslim criminal would be pardoned if he accepts Islam, or a zamindar or officer who could not collect enough revenue as budgeted, then unless he converts, he would be killed. Or again, promotions and career offers to those who convert to Islam, giving grants and other state benefits to entire village if the village converts to Islam. Those kind of inducements and means and mechanisms were continuously followed. And it may not be totally out of place, although we don't want to get too much in detail. But look at the state of the secular government of India, and whether it does not to some extent follow the same policy of promoting conversion away from Hindus into, on one hand, Islam, and on the other, Christianism. So that was more officially the policy even back then, as it continues to some extent in the asymmetry of the benefits offered by the constitution and the governments to Hindus versus the others. Anyways, that was the first theory, first explanation of how big number of Hindus converted potentially to Islam. Second that we often hear about is the so-called Sufis, who are peaceful missionaries and spiritual leaders of Islam, greatly impressed by their spiritual powers. Hindus in troves come to them and convert. That's the other theory that we hear about. In reality, however, if we look at the original sources of Sufis themselves, that does not seem to be true at all. And I would refer to this great work by Sayyid Attar Abbas Rizvi in 2 volumes called A History of Sufism in India. So in this, again, like I said last time, we should be very grateful to these professors, Muhammad Habib, Sayyid Attar Abbas Rizvi, and Professor K.S. Lal. Between these three, they have unearthed so much of literature, so much of obscure sources, so much of direct material which refutes so many of these false theories and beliefs. So I wanted to quote one part of this what Professor Rizvi writes in A History of Sufism in India, first volume. He quotes Professor R.C. Majumdar. The role of both medieval mysticism and Sufism in the history of Indian culture is often exaggerated beyond all proportions. Whatever might have been the value of either as a distinctive phase of Hinduism and Islam from moral, spiritual and philosophical points of views, their historical importance is considerably limited by the fact that the number of Indians directly affected by them, even at their heyday, which was short-lived, could not be very large. The number dwindled very appreciably in the course of time, and the orthodox religions showed no visible signs of being seriously affected by this sudden intrusion of radical elements. Professor Rizvi comes to the same conclusion as well, supporting his conclusion by volumes of support material. He says that the fingerprints of Sufis in the process of bringing non-Muslims to Islam is very minimal. So that's the second theory, and even in our own time we see that the Sufis have been successful in converting very small number of people. The famous cases of celebrities like that of musician A.R. Rahman in Tamil Nadu, or few here and few there, those cases are very small in number. That's not the role of Sufis. Sufis play an important role, but not the role of converting Hindus to Islam. But then the third theory that is often offered by the literature is that of the migration of Muslims from other places to India. Merchants came from Arabia, they already had the business contacts in India, and as in Arabia they became Muslims, they started spreading, sometimes deliberately, sometimes inadvertently, Islam to the communities they came in contact with. And similarly, another theory that is often heard is that a large number of Muslims from Iran, from Central Asia, from Turkey kept migrating to India. All the elite class of Indian Muslims, Ashrafs as they are known, the so-called high caste of Muslims, they are all migrants from abroad, and so on and so forth. But again, K.S. Lal, through his works, and two of his works are especially noteworthy. First is Indian Muslims, Who Are They? And the other one, The Legacy of Muslim Rule in India. He very clearly, and supporting it with enormous amount of evidences, says that that population was minuscule. Of course, these merchants would have married the local Hindu women, such as the case we see in Kerala, where not only they married the local Hindu women, for whatever reason the Hindu kings allowed these Muslim merchants to convert the fishermen and boatmen community. Not only allowed, apparently for whatever reason the king of Kerala promoted that conversion even. All of that might be true, but it is of a very small, minuscule population. Of course, in our time, we see that the population of Muslims coming from Bangladesh, or the Rohingyas, or indeed even from Pakistan itself, might be significant contributors to the changing demography, which perhaps explains the intensity of protests against CAA and such steps taken by the government of India. So there may be some truth to it, but the share of that factor in the larger Muslim population of India, that may be very small again. And then finally, another theory which has been promoted in the last few decades, definitely not more than 100 years perhaps, is this theory of social justice, where bunch upon bunch, village upon village of the so-called oppressed castes of Hindus, the Dalits, they saw great opportunity in converting to Islam and gaining social equality and justice. So we are all very familiar with that theory, and this theory is nothing but a bunch of concoctions without any fact, without any basis in history. In fact, all the Muslim sources, sometimes explicitly, most of the times implicitly, kind of refute that theory. But of late, that has become a kind of favored explanation of the conversion, even by the Muslim Maulanas. So if we hear the speeches of Ali Mia, who we have referred to several times, he lays much stress on both the Sufi and this conversion, because the Dalits wanted emancipation from the oppressive Hindu society. But if we look at the literature, for example, Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi says, Gisu Daraz, that's a Chishti Sufi, Gisu Daraz unsuccessfully tried to convert Brahmins to Islam. What is noteworthy is that both Chishtis and Suhrawardis only managed to convert high caste Hindus. The theory that the influence of Sufism and of Islamic egalitarianism were significant factors which led members of the Hindu lower classes to embrace Islam is unfounded. The Muslim conquests did not unleash forces of liberation or change the position of the exploited castes of Hindus or of the untouchables. The social and economic position of the masses of Muslim converts who accepted Islam under a variety of pressures, all of which have been analyzed by Jafari Makki, was in fact no better than that of Hindus. So, Jafari Makki is a source which details this process of conversion, and it enumerates the sources of those pressures which Sayyid Athar Abbas Rizvi is talking about. What are those pressures? And definitely this so-called egalitarianism or freedom from the so-called social oppression is not one of those. So that's what Professor Rizvi says. And also noteworthy is that predominantly these missionaries focused actually and preferred to focus on converting the high caste, so-called high caste Hindus rather than the Dalits. Another easy way to understand why this theory is false is to see the large number of Dalits that are present even today, right in the heart of the Muslim power of the medieval times, in the vicinity of Delhi and Uttar Pradesh and Punjab. Indeed, there is a very large number of so-called Dalit population of Hindus, and therefore, had this theory of egalitarianism been true, why are there such a large number of that population within the Hindu fold? Of course, this theory is patently wrong, peddled simply for the political agenda of, on one hand, harping on this oppression of Hindu society, and on the other, painting, whitewashing the record of Islam as a egalitarian and harbinger of liberalism to India. So that's not true at all. Now, of all these explanations of conversion, perhaps a synthesis of all these needs to be done. It would appear the process of conversion at a very high level, at a skeletal level, looks like this. The invader and the conqueror, and subsequently the Sultan, would apply the pressures, sometimes violent, sometimes that of inducement, to convert non-Muslim to Islam. Once that Muslim had converted, at least in the namesake, that is when the Sufi comes into picture. So Sufi is not the one who opens the door truly to Islam, but he is the one who then welcomes these converts and offers them solace, offers them consolation and spiritual peace within the new religion that the convert has been forced to adopt. And then again, at one place, Professor Rizvi mentions that a dead Sufi is more powerful than a living Sufi. Converts would worship and revere the local Sufi saint, and kind of the same devotional energy which they would have with their earlier deities would get transferred to the this local Sufi saint, etc. Practices which they had followed earlier, in most cases they would still continue to follow, such as the Gotra system, such as the rules of not marrying the cousins, such as many communities, Professor K.S. Lal records, would not even have the khatna or the circumcision. So these converts, they would worship one Sufi saint or the other, but they would practically maintain shikha or a choti. They would still wear dhoti or traditional Hindu attire. Even the names would be regular Hindu names. Perhaps they would have at their home ceremonies that their immediately previous generation followed for the marriage or for their samskaras. So they would continue to behave like their previous generations. Simply they have adopted an additional spiritual source in the larger pantheon they had. That new source would be the local shrine or the local Sufi saint. And this is very clearly seen in so many other cases, that even Sufis, successful or not, had tried to posit Islam as one more. So at least in the missionary polemic, Allah is offered as just a Bhagwan or Kartar or such names which the Hindus would be familiar already. The Sufi literature, especially the popular Sufi literature throughout the medieval ages, as is written in Hindi, Urdu, etc., or indeed much in other local languages also, Bengali, Avdi, etc. Allah is just one more deity truly in that larger pantheon of deities that the Hindus might have. So that is what the Sufis would do in this stage. And still at the end of that second process also, these Muslims would not be truly Muslims as Muslims are known for, that exclusivist theology of Allah alone, which is when the Qazi or the Maulana comes in, where they would transform this pseudo-Muslim into proper Muslim. They would apply the pressures of expelling all those non-Islamic ideologies and thought processes and take this new convert into a proper Islam as taught by the Prophet and as practiced by his initial followers. And yet this process was not so easy. In case of India, we see so many counter conversion processes. So these semi-converted Muslims many times would go back. Some of them would be just namesake Muslims, so they would outwardly change their names or appearances, but inwardly in their jati or in their family, they would continue to be as steadfast as a Hindu as they could practically can. And we have seen in recent times several cases coming forward, such as a famous family of musicians in West Bengal, whose surname was Khan for several generations. And he openly came out and said, I am not a Muslim anymore. He said, actually, we were never a Muslim. We used this surname simply to honor whatever titles were given to us, etc. But there are several examples where jamindars or small kings, etc., would convert for namesake to avoid some punishment or to win some court case, etc. and they would adopt Islam but not follow it. They would continue to follow 100%, at least inwardly, their ancestral faith. And then we also see several examples of very prominent going back, ghar wapsi, on their own, such as that of Kabir. So Kabir was son of the parents who had recently converted to Islam as part of the large conversion. And I think at the time of Tughlaq. So Kabir represents, as such a nicely explained by Acharya Hajari Prasad Dwivedi in his landmark work Kabir, he represents that counter conversion process. I'm using that word crudely. He explains it in a much nicer and much nuanced way. But at a very crude and high level, Kabir represents that going back to the roots, discovering the roots of his grandparents and going back where they had come from. And there are several such examples where if Sufis on one hand were kind of giving spiritual solace to this new convert, then there were so many Hindu personalities, be it Chaitanya, be it Nanak, be it Ramanandis, and so many other saints, especially in the Bhakti tradition, who would bring them back to the traditional fold. And it was silently done. This work was done. There are several examples much before Arya Samaj would start to do that in our time. So this Qazi and this Mullah who then transforms this pseudo-Muslim to proper Muslim is the work of Tabligh. And at this point, we should understand what Tabligh truly means in the Islamic terminology. So these three words, Dawa, Tabligh, and Islah, these are often used to explain this process of becoming a Muslim by Muslims themselves. Dawa is the stage one, where Dawa literally means invitation. Dawat, Urdu word, comes from this word Dawa in Arabic. Dawa is an invitation to Islam. The second step is, once invitation to Islam is given and let's say accepted, and somebody becomes a Muslim for namesake, then comes Tabligh. Tabligh means preaching. In a way, Tabligh is, now that this is a new Muslim, taking him and making him proper Muslim by telling him about how the namaz or salat is performed, what is the deeper meaning of this shahada or declaration of faith, etc. Basic practice of Islam, and making him do that practice. That is advice of that, preaching of that is Tabligh. And then the third step is Islah. Islah is transformation or a total change. Once he is now a practicing Muslim, then he needs to go deeper and become full Muslim in the mold of Prophet and his followers. That final radicalization, final step of conversion is Islah. Now, at the time of turn of the last century, early 1900s, naturally, as I mentioned, Islam had lost the political power, and therefore the third step, where Qazis and Mullahs supported by the state were able to convert properly the new convert into a practicing Muslim, that power was weakened on one hand, and on the other, led by not only Arya Samaj but several other actors, but definitely most visible in case of Arya Samaj, there was this ghar wapsi happening, where most of the times, even voluntarily, people would go back or want to go back to their ancestral religion, and with agency of Arya Samaj, which had actually started in the time of Dayananda itself. That Dayananda himself, perhaps in 1878, somewhere in that decade, converted a prominent Muslim back to the Hindu fold. And then, if we study the literature of Pandit Lekhram, and after that Swami Shraddhananda, and in fact there are so many other leaders. Some of them actually had converted from Islam back to the Hindu fold, and they were very well learned in the theology of Islam. Some of them were Qaris who had the Quran by heart. Some of them were Muhaddis. So I'm forgetting the names, but some of these, especially in Punjab and Uttar Pradesh, were Muslims who had converted to Hinduism. And just like in our time, we see Zakir Naik going around doing speeches and the sham debates. There used to be so many of this work going on in late 1800s, early 1900s. And through these debates, they would call Maulanas, and then they themselves, because they are very well read and mullahs themselves, ex-mullahs, they would have these mullahs for breakfast, lunch and dinner. So we see that happening, and as a result, Islamic society, the elites, the ashrafs, they were somewhat scared for the first time. They saw that we lost the political power, we lost all the battles in jihad, and now we are losing these new converts as well. And that is when Tablighi Jamaat truly in this form comes in play. We can see this in several evidences. I am not sure enough scholarly work has been done on studying this counter-conversion process without any political template. But for sure, we can see that the principalities or the states where Muslim rulers were ruling, they would order criminal punishments for a Muslim who converted back to Hinduism. Of course, in proper Sharia, the punishment for that is death. But even in early 1900s in India, we see rulers such as the great-grandmother of the Bollywood actor Saif Ali Khan, the Begum of Bhopal. She ordered a jarida, or issued an order in perhaps 1914 or so, that any Muslim of Bhopal state, if he converts to any other religion, he would be liable for punishment of varying degrees. Same thing can be seen in other Muslim states as well, Rampur and Hyderabad and so on, which shows that Arya Samaj Ghar Wapsi program was successful. And some of these converts were willingly, it didn't even require much effort. They were simply namesake Muslims, and they saw no reason to remain Muslim anymore. So they would be happy to go back to the religion of their ancestors. And I want to mention one more side comment, not much related, but recently, just a couple of weeks back, or maybe last week, this news came from Haryana, where an entire village of Mirasi Muslims. Mirasi is a jati that is traditionally in Hindu Samaj related with the music in the processions, etc., or marriages, etc. Later they became Muslims, and recently in Haryana they reverted back rather to the ancestral religion, and that became much highlighted news. So this, more or less exactly 100 years back, was happening at a much larger scale, far more widespread. And that therefore became much source of a crisis for the Muslim elite of India, Ashraf, or the high caste Muslims. So the disciple of the founder of Deoband Madrasa, and also of the failed jihadi, Mahmudul Hasan, their disciple Muhammad Ilyas Khandalvi, he accidentally found himself in middle of this situation, where in this district of Alwar, where Mayos which is a large number of one jati that had become under duress Muslim several centuries back. He came across them and he started this program of tabligh. So I won't go into too much detail of nitty-gritties because those are already published in the recent articles that have appeared in the media. But bottom line was he came up with this program which became really successful from their perspective. And it was very simple also. So team of Muslim missionaries would go to a village or another district away from their native place. Team of maybe 5 or 10 Muslims. They would live there in a mosque. And every day they would go on a tour which they call gasht. They would knock at the doors of the Muslim families. They would ask them to come to the mosque in the evening. And also they would give them some very simple messages such as how to do namaz, what is the meaning of kalma, etc. And then when Muslims, local Muslims had gathered in the mosque, there would be delivery of a inspirational speech or bayan as they call. And that speech would focus on very simple issues. There is no jihad preached there. Very simple issues of how to be a better Muslim. What does it mean to be Muslim? And it's a very simple curriculum, very simple messaging, which this semi-educated, not a learned Musliman would be able to adopt. And one of the things which the speaker would exhort his audience to do is to join them in this program and go to some other place and do the same. That serves two purposes. First of all, that's how they recruit the new tablighis. So if out of the audience of 100 people, even if one person volunteers to join them, he is asked to perhaps 3 days in a month devote to the program of tabligh. And then this new team that he will join will give him opportunity not only to do this missionary work and therefore add to the ranks of tabligh, but on the other hand also give him exposure to live like a true Muslim. So it's more like a training practically of how the Muhammad lived, and therefore we should live. And for that they have very fundamental, very small, simple things such as sleep on this side, not on that side, because the Prophet slept on one side of his bed or one curvet. You also should sleep like that. Which leg should come out of the mosque first or out of the bathroom first? All of those very simple fundamental things they practice, and they make this new follower of tabligh also practice. This way, as I said, they of course increase the following of tabligh, who then becomes the agent of change within his local community. He would then influence other Muslims, and typically they focus on younger folks who might not even be in a job, who might have finished college or might be finishing college, who might have ample opportunity, time and freedom so that they can do this job of missionary activity. And then another very far-reaching thing which this model does is they take them to the centers of the tablighs, which are now of course all over the world, but such as their global headquarters in Delhi, Nizamuddin. They call these centers as markaz, and there they have annual functions for several days, 3 or 4 days, and these are grand, huge gatherings. Perhaps tens of thousands of people gather from all over the world, and for them it gives an integration with the ummah. So slowly it, as we have seen, it had disconnected in a way them from the local community they lived in. It disconnected them from the practices and the cultural identity, the sense of dressing, etc., etc., of the local community that they were living with, and integrating them with the global Muslim community, gradually and slowly. So this consciousness that I belong to this local Sufi saint, or I have devotion for this shrine, slowly goes away, and I belong to a global brotherhood of Islam comes in. So disintegrate them from local Islamic group which is not truly Islamic, and plug him into the global Islam or Ummah is the another very important and impactful thing that Tablighi Jamaat has discovered. And then in politics, I think we would head for the conclusion, but a couple of points to make. Often we have been told that Tablighi Jamaat does not involve itself in politics, it keeps aloof, and it may sound true enough. They decouple themselves from politics, and yet important to note that a lot of actors of important political positions, we already mentioned Maulana Dr. Zakir Hussain, the President of India, several politicians of Pakistan, India and Bangladesh have been Tablighis. Similarly, a lot of terrorists had been Tablighis, ex-Tablighis, because of course this organization is very fluid. You don't become a member of Tablighi Jamaat. You went on Tabligh tours, you did attend the conferences at their markaz, you remained attached for several years, but you are free to do whatever you are doing. You are not a full-timer in a way. Noteworthy amongst those would be prime accused in the Godhra train burning case, for example. Also the conspirators of the murder of Haren Pandya, the Home Minister of Gujarat, was a very senior Tablighi Jamaat leader of Ahmedabad. But above all, that is not the role of Tablighi Jamaat. Those are incidental effects of Tabligh. Tablighi Jamaat for sure acts as that engine which, as I said, converts the semi-convert Muslim into a proper Muslim, which also integrates the local Muslim communities disconnected from their neighbors but connected to the global Ummah, and therefore serves a great political purpose without having to directly do day-to-day politics. So that's the history of Tablighi Jamaat. I think this is the point where I should apologize for making this unnecessarily long, and I should also thank you for your patience, and I should stop this atrocity at this time. Thank you so much. Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayah, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet. Om Shanti.